Okay, welcome. My name is Roger Berkowitz, and I'm the founder and academic director of the Hannah Arendt Center here at Bard College. Welcome to the virtual reading group. We are continuing to read The Life of the Mind, Hannah Arendt's last unfinished book. We're actually going to read only book one of that book on thinking, book two on willing. Where we're going to is fascinating and important, but quite philosophical. And at least our current plan is to leave that, and then book three on judging. She never wrote. We may have a final session where we talk about that. We're nearing the end. We have two more sessions on this book after today, and one of the things that we should start doing as we near the end is trying to understand the scope of the book and how it's working. And so maybe a little bit of backtracking is in order to start here. If we recall, the overarching question that Arendt is asking is about how thinking does not answer the need for truth, but the quest for meaning. And it's this quest for meaning as opposed to the quest for truth that really is the driving question of the whole book, let alone the section on thinking. And we need to ask ourselves, what does it mean to think? And how is thinking connected to the quest for meaning? In part two, Arendt specifically asks, sort of after the way and the place of thinking, how we think about thinking. And she says, in very schematic form, thinking needs speech. You can't think outside of speech. You can't think outside of some grammar, right? You can't just think without words in some way in which you think in. We think in words. That's a really profound insight. But she says thinking cannot be grasped in speech. The meaning that thinking seeks, in the sense that thinking is a quest for meaning, not a search for truth, is beyond words. And she cites Heidegger there, who has this idea that thinking is like a flash, or maybe happens in silence. And she says there's no metaphor for thinking, even though thinking itself takes place in metaphors that elevate us out of the everyday into the ineffable. There's no metaphor for thinking. What is the metaphor for thinking? And that's because the quest for meaning, which thinking is, has no result. And then she says at the end of that section, section 2, well, maybe there is a metaphor for thinking, or one that's close to it, and that is life, or being alive. Without the breath of life, the human body is a corpse. Without thinking, the human mind is dead. And this is really, about as close as we can get. To be alive is to think. Aristotle says the activity of thinking is life in Book Lambda of the Metaphysics. But even that metaphor, she says, is conceptually empty. It doesn't tell us anything about what thinking is. And so in the end, we can't really know what thinking is. And she says we need to move to another question, and that is not what thinking is, but what makes us think. And this brings us to part 3 of the first book of this book on thinking. And she says, well, what makes us think? And last week, Samantha led you through the first 2 chapters of this section. Very briefly, the Greek pre-philosophical idea is that we need poets and philosophers, spectators, another word for them, to perfect and correct the world of appearance. What poets do is they tell a story, and what philosophers do is tell us what is. And in so doing, they think. They give meaning to what is. They seek to immortalize, to make what is beautiful and true and coherent and ordered in a way that makes what is worthy of being loved and thus lasting. And these poets believe in an undying, an immortal world, but not yet an eternal world. They believe in an admiring and harmonious order. Plato, too, in the next chapter on the answers of Plato, begins in wonder. To immortalize, to behold and admire in wonder is to offer a glimpse of harmony and of order and truth. But the wonder of Plato gives way, she says, to the nausea of Sartre. Whereas Plato and philosophers like him saw the world as essentially wonderful, admiring, worthy, and thus ordered. When you think of Kant, and Kant talks to you about the moral law, he says, when we see people act morally, when we see people act in ways that just shock us in their moral content, we get down on one knee. We bow to them. And we are in awe of them. And the moral law becomes visible to us through their actions. And we submit ourselves autonomously to the moral law. That's what it means to be to set oneself under the law, to give oneself the law. I must act such that the maximum of my action accords with universal law. I do it because I'm in awe of this thing that I've seen. But when the rationality of the world, the religiosity of the world, the sacrality of the world, the beauty of the world, the harmony of the world, when that falls apart, when we no longer believe that the world makes sense, when tradition disappears as a binding force on us, when religion disappears, when even reason becomes something that is divided and diffuse instead of singular, the order disappears, and instead of an awe before the world, we have Sartre's nausea. That brings us to the two chapters that we read for today. One is called The Roman Answer to the question of what makes us think, and one is called The Answer of Socrates to the question of what makes us think. Briefly, because I don't think it's the key chapter here, the Roman answer is simply fear. If you've read Hobbes, I've been teaching Hobbes or with a friend this week. Hobbes, the world is poor, solitary, nasty, brutish, and short. We are afraid. And everything that in Hobbes and all modern political philosophy emerges out of this central insight that we are afraid and we need to somehow escape the state of nature. For the Romans, we are afraid and we need to escape the world of fear. And the answer of Roman and largely Stoic philosophy in Arendt's reading is that we turn inward. We seek to philosophize in the sense of simply preserving our sovereign independent self against the world, so that we emerge as a sheer consciousness, she says, a new entity, completely independent and sovereign. Philosopher in the Roman sense seeks a refuge from reality in the certainty, the self-certainty, the sovereignty of the self, which is cut off from the world but at least can't be touched. And thus, for the Romans, the beginning of philosophy is the fear and thus the annihilation of reality. There's an interesting digression at the end of this section where she talks about Solon, the first great Greek lawgiver, who wanders across the whole Mediterranean, seeking wisdom and seeking new ways to give the law to a people before he comes back to Athens and gives the law, the Solonic Code, the first great Solonic Code. And while he's traveling, he comes across King Croesus. It's a famous story. And Crisis, what we all know that what Crisis asks, or most of us do, which is he asks who is the happiest, and he expects Solon to fawningly say, "Of course you are, King Croesus." But instead, Solon says, "No man is happy, and no man can consider happy until he is dead." But Arendt is actually interested more in what happens before that, which is that Croesus addresses Solon and says to him, um, "You are visiting and wandering around the world. What have you learned in your philosophizing?" Right? And Arendt says this is the first use of the word philosophy that we have. And so she says, what is philosophy? Well, as Croesus used it and as Solon offers it, it's a doctrine. The doctrine is you can't be considered happy until you die. And she says this is unsocratic. And this is a sort of, let's call it a tense transition into the next chapter, which is I think in many ways, the next two chapters on Socrates, this one and then the next one on the two and one, could be considered the key chapters of this whole section on thinking, this whole first book of the life of the mind. And we're going to spend a lot of time on them. First, this one this week, and then the next one next week. What makes us think for Socrates? Well, if we have one answer, it's one word: love. Love is what makes us think. He says, philosophers and thinkers think out of a need. What is the need of thinking? Well, I'm going to choose a model, she says, an example. And this is a very Arendtian move. If thinking is something like being alive, if thinking is something that appears and yet can't appear, if something is invisible and we don't have a metaphor, how do we know what it is? Well, we have to pick a model. And in a very non-random choice, she picks Socrates as an ideal type of thinking. Why? Well, because in the end, Socrates is going to embody what she wants him to embody. It's a very, this is not a random choice. So there are 11 steps, I think, 11 points she now brings out about Socrates as the model of thinking and what makes us think. The first is that thinking is aporetic. It's an argument that leads nowhere. Socrates is well known for asking people questions and at the end saying, "We've learned that we learn nothing." That's his great takeaway. Second, thinking is non-conceptual. Even though Socrates talks about things like justice and houses, he's actually not trying to give you definitions of these. In fact, his whole point is that he comes to the conclusion that there are no definitions of these things. Third, talking and thinking about justice and piety can make us more just and more pious. This is a point Arendt returns to in a really fascinating essay she writes that was just published in Thinking Without a Banister by Jerome Cohn. I wrote a piece on it, which was published on Medium on the Arendt Center website about 6 months ago. But in some way, Arendt embraces the Socratic idea that even though we don't know what justice is, and even though we don't know what piety is, thinking and talking and thinking about justice and piety can actually make us more just and more pious. Why that is, we should talk a little bit more in Q&A afterwards, but in its essence, it's that in thinking about justice and piety, we supply ourselves with models, with images, with exemplars, and we are inspired by them. Examples are the go-kart of moral judgment, Kant says. Here I think that's the foundation for her claim that talking and thinking about justice and piety can make us more pious and just. The fourth point that she makes is that there are three different metaphors that Socrates describes himself with. The first is a gadfly. As a gadfly, the thinker arouses others to thinking. He stings them, he buzzes around them, and he makes them think and examine themselves. He bothers them until they realize they don't know what they're talking about. The second is the midwife. And Socrates says he's a midwife because he delivers people to their thoughts. He purges them of their opinions, their doxa, their false thoughts. He shows them their doxa is wrong, or as he puts it, is a wind egg, not a real baby. And thus, as a sterile person, the doctor, Socrates, the midwife, he simply shows you that your thoughts are wrong, and thus delivers you to thinking, which is being perplexed. The third is the electric ray, who stings you and freezes you, paralyzes you, and makes you stop and think. And even though you're frozen, that stopping and thinking, she says, is the highest feeling of being alive. So those are the three metaphors that he describes himself as. Fifth point is that Socrates is not a philosopher. He teaches us nothing. He's also not a sophist. He doesn't claim to make men wise. In fact, he claims the opposite. He claims to unteach you. The sixth point is, what is thinking good for? Or the question is, what is thinking good for, or why think? Arendt says that thinking is like an invisible wind or a storm of thought. And what it does, if you stand in the storm, in the windstorm, and don't seek refuge in concepts or in ideologies, what thinking does is it destroys all creeds. It's the most dangerous thing because it destroys all things that stand in its way, all ideas that want to hold on and say we are true. Which is why Arendt can say here, and again in her famous essay on thinking and moral considerations, that there are no dangerous thoughts. Thinking itself is dangerous. What she means by that is that thinking is destructive. It destroys all certainties, all creeds. That's number 7. Thinking can lead, and thus thinking can lead to cynicism and nihilism. Thus, the danger of thinking is not that it destroys things per se. It's that if you take its destructive capacity as the essence of thinking, as nihilists do, you make the nihilist conclusion that there is no truth. That thinking shows us that there is no justice, there is nothing good, and therefore everything is permitted, which is the nihilist mantra. And that's the danger of thinking. The 8th point is that although nihilism is the danger of thinking, nihilism is not inherent in thinking. Namely, a thinker doesn't have to give in to nihilism. You can stand in the storm of thought and not think that nothing matters and that there are no highest thoughts and that everything is permitted. You can question all creeds and yet still know the importance of believing in something. The 9th point is that the greater danger than thinking, which would be nihilism, is non-thinking. And the danger of non-thinking is that if you don't think, you're caught up in ideologies and rules, and you believe in rules, and you believe in following rules and following customs and following orders. And there's nothing easier, she says, than taking rule-bound, orderly men and women and changing the rules that they follow. And she says you can do that as easy as we change the silverware at a dinner table. And that's what she thinks happened in Nazi Germany and Stalinist Russia. You had rule-bound, very conformist populations, and you had a dictator demagogue come in who simply gave them new rules to follow, and they followed them because they follow rules. They didn't think. The 10th point is that to think and to be fully alive are the same, which was the same way she ended the last section. And then the 11th point is that the quest for meaning requires thinking, which requires love. What do we love? Love is a need. And what we need and what we love is meaning. So the true thinkers are those who love meaning and know they don't have it, and turn to thinking as a way of seeking meaning. Okay, so that's a attempt to bring us through where we are up to in the reading in the book today. I'm happy to hear your questions and thoughts. I see there's one in the chat. I can go to that, or if anything immediately pops to your mind, anyone wants to get something in right away, I'll let you do that. All right, let me start with Daphne's question on 177. Daphne writes, on non-thinking, the more firmly the men need to hold on to the code, need relatively little force. Yeah, I mean, I think I was just talking about that near the end of what I said, but let's just read what she says. She says, non-thinking, which seems so recommendable a state for political and moral affairs, also has its perils. Let's just stop and reflect on that claim. Why is non-thinking seemingly recommendable for political and moral affairs? Because it leads to obedience. It leads to a common set of rules that we share. And so if you're a politician, the last thing you want are thinking citizens. You want to be able to tell them what to do and have them do it. Very much in a military mindset. And so it seems like that what you want is a docile, conformist population. By shielding people from the dangers of examination, it teaches them to hold fast to whatever the prescribed rules of conduct may be at a given time in a given society. That's her point. What people then get used to is less the content of the rules, a close examination of which would always lead them into perplexity, than the possession of rules under which to subsume particulars. Now, this is sort of what we might call her great philosophical insight about political rule following. People follow the rules not because they agree with them, not because they've thought about the rules, but because they want the rules. I mean, for her, the greatest exemplar of this is Adolf Eichmann, right? I mean, we can maybe the most important line of the whole Eichmann in Jerusalem book is when Arendt is discussing the fact that Eichmann is asked by the judges, did you know this was wrong, what you're doing? And he says, well, I did in some way, and I went to my superior officer and I complained about it. This is after he had gone and seen people shot and gassed in the East. And I thought it was wrong, and I cried, and he actually says I peed in my pants or shit my pants, I think he said. And he comes back and he says to his officer, his commander, he says, this seems wrong. And his commander says, no, it's what we're doing. And he said, okay. And she says, and the judge asked him, how long did it take you? And he said, about 3 weeks. And she says, this is the greatest lesson that we learned from this whole horrible fiasco, is that it takes about 3 weeks to turn one's moral reasoning around and come to see it as good to follow orders that 3 weeks ago you thought were wrong and now you embrace as right. And this is how easy it is. And what she says is, in this line here, what people get used to is not the content of the morals, but the having of clear morals. That's what they get used to, and that's what they want. So that if somebody appears, she writes, who for whatever purposes wishes to abolish the old values or virtues, he will find that easy enough, provided he offers a new code, and he will need relatively little force and no persuasion. That is, proof that the new values are better than the old, to impose it. It's easy to do. All you have to do is tell people these are the new values, and people will say, Okay, I'm glad we know what the values are now. I mean, you're seeing this happen in the United States in the last 2 or 3 years. I mean, you could actually say in the last 50 years. But in the last 2 or 3 years, at least within a certain segment of the population, there's been a rewriting of the codes of values. And you have someone at the top of the country's authority structure, the President of the United States, telling people it's all right to say certain things. It's all right to do something. And many of the same senators and politicians and pundits who 2 years ago would have condemned this kind of behavior and the kind of behavior not only the president is making, but other people in his name are now saying, that's okay. It's how easy that happens. It's not hard. The more firmly men hold to the old code, the more eager will they be to assimilate themselves to the new one. And this, of course, brings us back to the very beginning of this whole book, which is important for us to remember, which is that the whole book is written, and the inquiry into thinking is written with an eye towards asking the question is there anything that can prevent men from doing evil? And her hypothesis is that if we do evil because we simply don't think, and we are easily adapted to new and evil codes because all we care about is having a code, not what the code is, the one thing that may be able to prevent evil is thinking. Daphne, is that gonna, you want more, or is that gonna help answer your question?
The point that I think I was kind of held up upon was the more firmly men hold on to the old code, the more eager they will be to assimilate to the new one. That's the part that troubles me. I keep thinking about the Conservative Party in the United States right now, and I just finished reading Dark Money, and the Koch, I don't even know how to pronounce their names, the Koch or Koch brothers. I mean, these are people who obviously are capable of thinking, and in fact, in some circles, think deeply, but they're not going to give up their old code ever. It's like holding on to it for dear life. So I'm not sure about that particular sentence. If they're already entrenched in a code, they're not that easy to sway. And the other point that came to my mind was, when I was an officer in the Israeli army, a lot of the people that were easily to incite to the idea that our cause is totally justified were the young people, whereas the older people would hold on and hold off and be more reserved. So to some extent, I find that she doesn't account for the fact that that ability to influence people and change them is not always those who hold on firmly. It's the ones who have nothing to hold on to yet. But I don't know if that's contradicting what she's saying here. So that's where you're going to help me, right?
Yeah. No, I don't think it's contradicting, but I think they're both really good points. I mean, the Koch brothers are an interesting case. First of all, there's two of them, and they're not the same. One of them just died last month. I don't know if you caught that. But what's interesting right now is that the Koch brothers are somewhat turning into one line of resistance against Donald Trump. They've been very, very opposed to Trump. This is not to say good or bad. It's just to say conservatism has many different sides to it, and I think Donald Trump is hardly a conservative. The point that she wants to make is that if you hold on to the old code eagerly and strongly, you do that less because you believe in the code for most people than because you want a code to hold on to. Now, that's not true for everybody. There are some people who are true believers. But she thinks most people are not, especially most people who don't think, and she doesn't think most people think. So certainly Eichmann was someone who easily switched one code for the other. One of the puzzles that a lot of people have had about politics in this country in the last couple of years is that the moral majority, the Christian right, has so embraced a president who's about as far from a Christian as you could imagine. So this fits quite well with her idea that for most people who hold strong ideological positions, it's not actually the ideology, it's not actually the substance that is what attracts them. It's the belief in a core, in rules and being rule bound. So I mean, I don't know enough about the Koch brothers to get into them. Do they think or not? I mean, the fact that they're brilliant doesn't mean they think. She thinks many very smart people don't think, including Eichmann. She thought was smart but didn't think. And you could be a very smart person who's calculating and understands how to achieve certain things. That doesn't mean you seek meaning, which is what she thinks thinking is about. Your example of the Israeli army, I take the question to be one of youth versus maturity. Edmund Burke was one of the first people, at least first people I know of, who thought that one of the great dangers of the English imperial project was that it sent so many young soldiers to fight unethical imperial wars and brought them back to England afterwards, having at a young, before they had been able to become people with character who could resist orders, brought them back to England, having already done so many awful and evil things that it imperiled the English democracy. So I think, when you teach people very young to go to war and to follow orders and to not think, which is basically the ethic of the army, to be smart, to do a lot, but not to think, you have to obey, you train people in the art of not thinking. Why are older people, in your experience, better than that? I mean, I'm not sure all are, but older people are often more open, more less concerned with success and proving oneself, and more open to contemplation and reflection. At least that's, Socrates in the Republic, Cephalus in Book One of the Republic says that you can only philosophize when you're old, because desire has left you, and only once desire has left you do you have the time to philosophize. Socrates, I think, might agree with part of that, although he does think you need desire, you need eros, not agape, but eros, different kind of desire to philosophize. I'm not sure if I've answered your question, Daphne, or not. I'm trying. Maybe we'll come back to it.
Roger?
Yeah.
As I listened to you, who came to my mind was James Fishkin and his deliberative polling, because it seemed to me that what that does is it compels people, or gives people an incentive to think, and also a place and assistance in thinking. And I'm wondering whether that's some kind of a model that society can use, whether it's in that particular format or some other, to change. He argues that electoral politics is competitive in the sense that it does away with thinking. It's just a matter of who can instill someone to vote for them. And that you can say anything you want, doesn't have to be truthful, it doesn't have to make sense, it has to resonate, it has to motivate someone to do something. And then in the last election and in other elections throughout the world, we saw how the internet was used to do the same thing.
Yes.
Does Fishkin give us something to think about, I guess?
Yeah, I think that's a good point, Howard. And for those who don't know, James Fishkin is a professor out in California and has written a number of books on participatory polling and participatory democracy. He spoke at our conference 2 years ago, and you can go look at his speech on our website, which is actually really wonderful. The basic idea behind it is that instead of a democracy by polling, where you just poll people, do you like healthcare? Do you like universal healthcare? Do you like corporate healthcare? Do you like abortion? Do you not like abortion? And letting people answer what their opinion is, their doxa, their unthought ideas. The idea is you get 100 people or some number of people together in a room, randomly chosen, and you educate them for 2 days and you let them educate themselves. You give them experts who come in and give from different sides and give proposals, and they get to subpoena people and bring them in to talk and ask them questions, and they get to read stuff, and they get to talk in small groups and then in bigger groups. And over 2 days, these 100 people with very different opinions, randomly chosen, then come to a vote and talk about and try to actually come to a consensus or a vote, figuring out what they think they should do. And his argument is that these kind of polls create much more thoughtful outcome decisions than regular opinion polls, and that our democracy has been too captured by sort of just thinking that whatever people think is what is their opinion, whereas we actually want to educate people and then ask them their opinion. So yeah, I mean, obviously, the reason I bring him is because I think he's important, and I think that this kind of potential thinking is important. A corollary of this idea of participatory polling, or a complementary idea, is what we might call sortition, the idea that we should use chance and lottery to some degree in picking our representatives who would then make decisions. The idea being that when you have elections, people vote based on whoever's running, and people who run generally are people with money, and they're able to convince you to vote for them based on, propaganda and ideology. Whereas if you put some people in there chosen randomly and then make them participatorily engage in a debate, there's a better chance that they will bring new ideas to the table. Just an FYI, in 2020, in October, the next Hannah Arendt Center conference will be on these ideas, participatory democracy and sortition, and how to revitalize democracy through them. So they're ideas we're working on and care a lot about.
Roger?
There were two
Hi.
people. Here, Margaret came through first here.
I guess I was just wondering if implicit in the notion of a code that's sort of easier to swallow whole, as you were just describing, if there is some sort of implicit notion of or value in it. And I guess the example that comes to mind is, I can't tell you how many conversations I've had over the last few years about the fact, and not just the last 2 or 3 years, but the last several years, about people who vote against self-interest. So for example, just by way of hypothesis, imagine that you are, you're working class and you're supporting a supportive family on 35 grand a year, but you are in favor of repealing any taxes on inheritances, which you have no chance of getting in your life. But somehow in there is a belief that you might, or a mythology of American hope, or a something that allows you to swallow whole a code that not only isn't going to benefit you, but is probably going to hurt you in certain instances. I mean, this is just the first concrete example that came to mind. But I guess I'm wondering if this code that she's talking about is really something quite so neutral, value neutral, or hope neutral as she's writing it to seem.
So, I mean, I hear two questions in there, and I'm not sure I'm understanding the connection between the two of them. One is about her claim that people who hold on to an old code the more eager they do so, the more eager they will be to assimilate to a new one. And the other is people voting against self-interest, which seems to me a separate point. I mean, I take it the point, Margaret, that you're trying to make, if I understand it, is that people who vote against self-interest are assimilating to a new code. Is that the sort of assumption that I'm hearing?
No, sorry for the lack of clarity in my question, but I guess what I'm seeing, I take her point, and I take her point about the way in which those who accept an entirety of a code can more easily be led to a new one, provided, as she says, that it provides, the entirety of a code. My question is, if there isn't some implicit promise or hope in that code, whether it's factually valid or not, that allows someone to swallow it.
Yeah. Okay. So I think that's true, but one has to ask what that promise is. What Arendt's analysis, as she develops it in The Origins of Totalitarianism, and then again later in Eichmann and other places, Eichmann in Jerusalem, is that the hope and meaning that one gets from believing in a code is more connected to the sense of belonging and purpose that one gets by being part of something than to the content of the code. So what she says is that at least in the modern era, where people are lonely and abandoned in the sort of nausea sense that we read about last week in Sartre, in the chapter on what's the chapter called? Plato as Answers and Its Echoes. When she talks about Sartre and she talks about nausea and the aloneness and the sense of being abandoned and alone, what people then, what they find meaningful in embracing a code is not the substance of the code, but then being part of something that matters and telling them that something, they're part of something meaningful. Now, in an older, more traditional era, when you believed in something like Christianity or Buddhism or Judaism or whatever it was, and it was deeply embedded in the institutions and the world in which you grew up, it might be harder to simply switch that around. I think if that's your point, I think that's a fair point. But what she's talking about in this last chapter, in the pages that we've just been reading, is really about a time in which we've already entered a time in which largely people are rule abiding without having given it much thought. I mean, and it may be that people in ancient Rome and in ancient Greece and in ancient Jerusalem didn't give much thought to their beliefs, but the traditions and institutions and way that they were habituated into life were so all-encompassing and profound that even though they didn't think about it, it was harder to switch them out. Today, it's very easy to switch them out, and that's something she talks about. Sam, I think you want to say, you want to say something?
I want to take a stab and approach it from a bit of a different angle in the way that I'm reading these two pages we've been looking at. So I agree with everything Roger's saying, but I think maybe part of the frustration and trying to understand what she's saying about willingness to accept codes comes in the way that she's framing it. So this section is actually her rewriting her essay on responsibility under dictatorship and moral considerations. And she's explicitly thinking about the example of Nazi Germany. Her question in writing these two pages is, under the Nazi regime, it became legal to kill people. And to go along with the Nazi regime was now a legal activity, right? So the laws were flipped, right? Whereas, you have this, well, it's against the law to murder. Now the law is murder. How does that flip in values happen within a society, and how do people go along with it so easily? And I read her here to be saying that people actually, it's not so much about meaning or content, but it's about the way that we as subjects in a society, as citizens in a society, respond to the laws that structure everyday life. So we just go along with the laws, and that's part of our relationship as citizens in a state. She says it teaches us to hold fast to whatever is prescribed as rules for codes of conduct at a given time in a given society. And we get used to going along with that. And it's funny because it is meaning in a certain sense, but it's also relieving us of the need to think, which is a different kind of meaning, right? We don't have to take it upon ourselves to think about what is legal and what is illegal and what is right and what is wrong, when we can just look to the law to tell us what is right and what is wrong. And, oh, so this is the way it must be. And that's where she's then shifting to this idea of self-reflective thinking, which is exactly what Adolf Eichmann is lacking, right? This capacity to engage in an active thinking process where he's thinking about what is right and what is wrong. And the example she gives in, just to end here, the example she gives in the essay on thinking under dictatorship, she says, what's the difference between the person who chose to obey the law under the Nazi regime and the person who broke the law? She says the answer is thinking, right? And so she's trying to get us to think about why we should not just go along with the laws as they're given to us by the authorities within a society, who are always going to manipulate the law to their own advantage. I mean, this is a classic point in political philosophy. Machiavelli makes it, Plato makes it. The laws are written by those in power to protect the powerful. And their interest. And Arendt is getting us to push back against that.
So,
Sam, I just want to say that changing the word that you just did from code to law, there was sort of a click in my brain. I kind of understand it now, because it's not just that you want to believe in an ideology, it's that the things that you live by have suddenly flipped on you. So thank you for that.
Sam, I'm wondering, as I listen to your argument, whether Foucault is important here, where you look at the, what does he call it, the geological, going back in the history of this law and how it developed and what were the power structures that benefited from the way the law developed, to give you something to think about.
Yeah. So Arendt's definitely not a Foucauldian. I just want to throw that out there. But if you're interested in Foucault's take on this argument, his side of it, I would look at his lectures on state, territory, and population, where he gives a history of how the state was established as a body of laws to protect the physical landmass of the city and to control the population. Arendt's approaching it from a much different angle than Foucault, but I think in this chapter that we've been talking about and in the Foucault, we're getting a lot of Nietzsche. There's a lot of Nietzsche being smuggled in here, and that's where I would draw the two together on the beyond good and evil and the genealogy of morality. They're both making a kind of Foucauldian maneuver and asking the question, how do values get flipped in society?
So HSC, I'm not sure who that is, but they ask, thinking dangerous in itself? Is the danger only linked to the risk of falling into nihilism? Or is it possible to connect it to the search for stability, certainty? Well, if thinking is dangerous in itself, thinking is not what leads to stability. Non-thinking leads to stability. The danger of thinking is that what thinking does, which is put you in the storm of thought and destroy all creeds, all codes, all laws, whatever it is, the many words you want to use, it can become its own creed, which is that since everything is destroyed, there is nothing, and that nothing is above something. I mean, the mantra of nihilism is nothing is the greatest. There are no greatest ideas. There's only nothing. And so that's the danger, is that you take what thinking offers. I don't want to say produces because it doesn't produce anything, but what it offers, which is destruction of all creeds, and you make that into a creed. That's the danger that accompanies thinking. So I don't know. If you want to ask more about that, you can. But that's how I. Yeah. Hi.
Hi, this is Simten Kosar actually, but as I was registering, I didn't know that I would appear as such. So,
It's okay.
This is Simten.
Hi.
I'm going to write now. Hi, thank you for your answer. The question was, and it answered, but I just want to add some comment. The question was based on the practice with the experience with those regimes which mark certain thinking processes, certain thinking patterns, certain thoughts as dangerous to the regimes themselves, to the order. So when we just define thinking process, the danger in thinking process in relation to nihilism, we might just, do we evade the risk that thinking as a creative activity pose against authoritarian regimes? So is the dangerous element in thinking has to be all the time connected with negative features of nihilism? The question was kind of evolving to that way.
So there's two things that it makes me think of your question. So thank you. One is that there is a danger to thinking as well, especially in a time like today, insofar as thinking destroys and tears apart. Even if the person thinking doesn't want to turn it into a creed, it can weaken institutions and norms and allow others to take advantage of that. One of the things Arendt talks about in The Origins of Totalitarianism is the way so many intellectuals in the 1920s and 30s, 1910s, 20s, and 30s, were so contemptuous of bourgeois culture at the time, and wrote scathing attacks, sending up and satirizing sort of good bourgeois German Weimar culture. And she said, while they were, of course, right, that there was a lot to be dissatisfied with, in a way, their weakening and tearing apart of the norms and institutions of bourgeois culture worked hand in hand with the mob, which wanted to take power from the powerful, and that also enabled the masses to then emerge as another vehicle of nihilist destruction. So to the extent that the intellectual critique and that thinking becomes one of destruction without offering a new positive idea, if it's just destruction, it can lead and bleed into the kind of destruction that opens the door for nihilism and for even authoritarian or totalitarian ideas. There was the other side of your question, if I understood it, had something to do with, in an authoritarian regime, is thinking dangerous? Well, I think it's dangerous to the regime, but maybe I misunderstood the rest of the question. But You tell me.
Well, it is. Yeah, you're right. Actually, it is dangerous to the regime. But I mean, there I was trying to point out that when we relate thinking as a dangerous process, if I call it right, a process, does it only connote nihilism, or is it to do with what is, as I said, what is searched in modern times mostly? Definitive answers to the questions that come out of thinking process itself. That aim to what Arendt calls, in reference to Heidegger, that aim to escape from that wind, that destruction of the wind.
Okay.
Uh,
So I think there's a
so,
couple of ways we can talk about the danger of thinking, right? One is nihilism. That's the first one I talked about. The second is the one I talked about in the answer to your question a couple seconds ago or a minute ago, which is that it can, even if it doesn't reach nihilism, it can destroy institutions and create a kind of cynicism that allows for nihilism or other kinds of evil things. Then you're talking about it. Then isn't there? You're saying isn't there another danger of thinking, which that it can make people internal. It can take them away from reality. It can make them lose their connection to the world and just worry about, what, clean my hands. As long as I think and do whatever's right, I don't have to worry about everyone else. That sort of reaches into the chapter on the Roman answer that we talked about, that when thinking becomes a retreat from the world. And yes, Arendt thinks that there's a great danger in thinking, that we cease to concern ourselves with the world and concern ourselves with our own moral soul or our own eternity and turn away from the world. So that could be another danger of thinking. Another one would be that the philosopher's danger is similar to that, which is that you get so caught up with truth and ideas of truth that you forget that you live in a world with others, in a plural world. So, yeah, I think there's a bunch of different dangers of thinking we could add to this. Those last two, though, are dangers of thinking in the philosophical and the Roman sense that are not Arendt's sense of thinking. So I was trying to say, even in the Arendtian sense of thinking, as an activity of life and constant turmoil and living in the wind of thought, and Socratic idea of thinking, there are dangers, and we have to be aware of those too. Okay?
it's okay. Can I put a last note on that?
Yeah, I'll let, yes, please.
Yeah. In my question, the way I understand danger, it's never only a negative thing. I mean, in terms of conceptualizing danger out of the experiences with what comes next, I'm thinking about daring to be exposed to danger in certain settings. So thinking as a dangerous process does not always have to lead us to a negative stance on this earth. That's why I was trying to understand it. I totally thank you for your answer, by the way. It just cleared my mind up, but in order to express myself better. But here, for me, thinking as a dangerous process is not only about negativity. It's also to do with us as human beings stepping into those areas which risks our well-being, which risks our survival, but which makes us to transcend beyond just thinking, no, acting out of the interest for survival. Thank you for that. So I'm stepping further there.
No, great. I think that's one of the great points in this section that we just read, is that thinking is dangerous and yet also deeply meaningful. And we have to be aware of its dangers if we're going to proceed in it. I think that's to see the many-sidedness of thinking, I think, is important.
Thank you.
Yep. If people need to jump in, but I'll continue going through the list. Jack writes, in a way, the oft-cited deep division in American society is a struggle between two sets of rules, which without thinking, appear to be contradictory, with people on each side holding fast to the rules they have adopted. I'll accept that. The only thing I would say is I think there's many more than two sides to the deep divisions in American society. But I think that without a doubt, people embrace beliefs of different external groups that they identify with. There's part of me that wants to say more about that, but I'm not sure I'm going to right now. All right, I'll say a little bit. I've been reading David Reisman's book, The Lonely Crowd, which is, didn't know this, but it's the most read book of sociology in the history of the United States. And it's worth rereading if you haven't read it. But Reisman makes a three-part distinction between different ways that we conform to society. In the tradition, we conform to, whether it's religion or parents or the institutions, we conform to a well-honed, powerful tradition in which we grow up in and we embrace. But with the break in tradition, with the loss of religion and tradition and the weakening of it, he says that the first sort of response to that was what he calls an inner-directed way of conforming, where we are educated by parents and teachers and institutions, and while those institutions themselves are weaker and don't tell us as directly how to act, we have an internal gyroscope which gives us a sense of our own, direction, and we seek to follow it. And there's an inner-driven direction, but clearly still directed by a certain amount of authority, but with a much freer range. And he says that's really from the mid-19th century to the 1950s, that was largely how in America, at least, and in most of the West, people began to conform to a society. And then he argues that starting in the 1940s and 50s, at least in the big cities in America and moving outwards, a new form of conformity emerges, which he calls other-directedness. And he says that people no longer have one set of parents or authorities or teachers or mentors that teach them and give them an internal gyroscope, an inner sense of structure and order. And what increasingly people seek to accommodate and assimilate their actions to whatever group they need to please and belong to at that moment. And so, what he says is we begin to be other-directed, and we lose any kind of internal gyroscope. And whatever group we are part of or need to feel part of, we assimilate into and conform to that group. I think it's a very powerful sociological analysis, and then we can draw questions of it. But especially at a time of social media and affinity groups and identity politics, and the way people need to belong to these groups and mold their actions and their opinions to fit with whatever groups they're part of at that time, and how they can switch between groups very easily. Strikes me, I don't know, Jack, your question, I mean, part of it is I'm reading this book and I'm thinking a lot about it, but your question certainly made me think about it.
Isn't that where people pleasers came, Roger?
Is that, say that again?
Isn't that where the phrase people pleasers came from? It's a long time ago now. It's an old.
Yeah, he uses that. He does use that phrase.
Pleasers are the second category. Yeah.
Yeah. Thanks, Patrick.
I think, Roger, the thing that I was thinking about is that the differences, which can seem very profoundly different, could be a lot of the differences could be reconciled if they weren't thought to be contradictory. that there is an assumption that what I'm holding fast to is so different from the other that I don't even want to talk to the other, right? Whereas the idea, if there was some way for dialogue to take place, that a lot of the contradictions wouldn't vanish, but they would become clearer in a way that would make them would make the contradictions themselves acceptable in everyday life.
Yeah, I mean, it's very possible. I mean, I think there are meaningful, I mean, if you believe that abortion is murder, and I believe that that choice is a part of a dignity of a woman and all people, whether we can compromise on that is hard. Although the traditional American way that we compromise on it is we have different states, and different states have different rules, and people can exist differently in different parts of the state, and there's a pluralism. But when you believe that your way is the only way, and anyone who disagrees with you is immoral, then you don't allow that kind of traditional American pluralism to emerge, and it makes it much harder to have these kind of compromises, as you would put it, or reconciliations. So,
I just want to go backwards for a minute to something that was being talked about earlier, because when the issue was brought up about the power in the public of the Nazi ideology and then resistance to it, it occurred to me that the resistance, such as it was often as rule bound as the adherence. That a person stands up to Hitler because he or she believes that some higher power has told them that what's happening is immoral because my morality comes out of the church or some other, without not through thinking necessarily. Although I think what I'm arguing against the idea that it requires thinking to resist tyranny. That sometimes the resistance to tyranny.
I think that could be a great point, Jack. I mean, so let's make a distinction then. There have been a number of people who've tried to ask the question you're asking, which is, why did some people resist and others not? And one answer, I mean, someone named Wolfgang Hoyer, who's written about this a lot and has a couple essays in the Hannah Arendt Center journal, the journal of the Hannah Arendt Center, on this question. Argues that the people, if you study the people who resist evil, you'll find that they generally are people who have some strong belief system, whether it's religious or traditional, or some strong adherence to something, which fits, I think, your thesis that it's not necessarily that they think, but that they had some strong other tie or order that helped them to resist. But
we used to call that a moral imperative.
It could call it a moral imperative, but it was something else that they deeply believed in, and that what allowed them to resist the new one. And that raises questions about, the claim that she makes about, well, do all people who embrace one order or law or code easily switch to the other? I think what you would have to then ask is, there are different ways people believe in a law, code, or order. Some believe it just because they believe it and they need the order and the code, and some believe it because they've actually internalized it. And that was the distinction I was trying to talk about before. And I think what you see is that some people really do believe these codes, although most don't. And I would actually say that in order to really believe those codes, you actually have to think. You have to have asked yourself, do I really believe this? Is this really valuable to me? Is this meaningful? Because if you don't ask yourself those questions, then it's really not a thoughtful embrace, and it's going to be a weaker embrace of these ideas. And so I think that there's going to definitely be a way in which the people who resist have not only have a moral code that they hold on to, but have been thoughtfully interrogating it in some way so that that moral code means something to them in a way that it doesn't for other people who adhere to it more thoughtlessly. I can't prove that right now, but there's a wonderful book as well called Beautiful Souls by A.L. Perez. And he looks at 4 different people who've resisted what they consider to be unjust regimes in the modern era, and does really deep dive sociological analysis of these 4 people. And I think what you'll see if you read that book, or what I took away from it, is that all of them not only had strong value systems, but thought about them and were really thoughtful, thinking individuals. So that would be where I would. I mean, so I think you're right to raise that question, but I think when you hold on to a viewpoint, there's going to be different ways that you do so. Johanna asks on page 153. Hegel states that the need for philosophy arises when the unifying power has disappeared from the life of men, when the opposites have lost their living tension of their interrelatedness and their mutual interdependence, and have become autonomous. Can we see this in light of what seems to be happening in the US? The myths have no more meaning. Those myths do not hold people together here. Happiness seems elusive, that is, happiness in the sense that philosophers understood it. I look at what seems to be a constant now violence against those who are different. Does the document that Jefferson was inspired to write seem more and more irrelevant? Okay, I think those are good observations. The idea that the need for philosophy arises when the unifying power has disappeared. This is the Roman answer, and it's also the Hegelian answer. Hegel says that philosophy emerges out of an Entzweung, a splitting into two. It's when philosophy emerges when the order breaks down. Another way of saying this is, you don't write the Jews and the Romans didn't write law codes when they were living healthy, vibrant societies. The Romans wrote their law codes at the end of the Roman Empire as it was falling apart. The Jews wrote the Bible and Deuteronomy when they were already in exile. The idea here, and to go back to Samantha's point, Nietzsche is one of the main thinkers here, is that you begin to write these codes down as the society is dying. And when the society is healthy, people know what the norms are and the rules are, and you don't need to write as much of it down. You want to apply it to America, Johanna, that's fine. I think it's undoubtedly true. I think this is something that's been happening for 200 or 300 years. And it's all over the West and increasingly outside the West as well. But yes, I mean, we are currently living in a time in which the unifying orders of that hold people together, the common world, is increasingly in question, if not even destroyed. And our response in the Sartrean sense is a kind of nausea at any idea of unity or order. And so we run away from it and embrace whatever particular opinion we have at the moment. One way to read the founding of the United States is and this is actually the way Arendt reads it, I think, is as a last-ditch effort to come up with a political system that can exist in a world without such a common traditional order. So if you think of, the fact that nation states are governed by a particular nation, and are supposed to be national and have a certain national viewpoint or national order. The United States, in her mind, was the first great state that wasn't a nation state. It was supposed to be a state that was held together not by one idea, one creed, one nation, but by an embrace of plurality and difference, and that was codified by the principle of federalism in the United States Constitution. And that was an attempt to create what she calls, actually not what she calls, what other people have called in a very Arendtian sense, a lowest common denominator sense of national order. That, we were a nation, or we were a state at least, or a nation state, but one that had the lowest common sense of what a national order would be, and that the national order of the United States was actually very weak. I mean, the national government was always much smaller than the state governments. It was much weaker than the state governments, and most of your daily life was not in any way controlled by the national government, but by the state governments. That experiment in federalism has, to a large degree, failed, as the United States has become a national country, a centralized country. There are people who'd like to restore it. I wrote about this a little bit in the Amor Mundi piece last week, but I think you're certainly right, Johanna, in your claims. Do you want to say any more? Johanna? No? Katie writes, I am thinking of the introduction where Arendt asks, could the activity of thinking as such, regardless of the results and specific content, could this activity be among the conditions that make men abstain from evil doing, or even actually condition them against it? We've been discussing how this connects to the danger of non-thinking. I'm wondering how this quote might be connected with the idea that thinking about justice and piety cultivates justice and piety. Okay, good. How can thinking condition us against evil doing? One way is, as we've been talking about, creating this destruction of creeds, but also in the Socratic sense of being a gadfly, being a midwife, and being a stingray. One way she puts it in another essay is when everyone is swept away, when the tide sweeps away all the people into common action, the thinker who is stung and who stays there and stops and thinks becomes not only holds him or herself back from the mass, but becomes an example of someone who's not just going along unthinkingly and might encourage other people to think and hold themselves back. How does thinking and talking work to serve justice? Well, as I said before, insofar as you think and talk and you bring yourself to think about justice and you talk about examples of people who acted justly, be it Gandhi or Socrates or Martin Luther King or whoever your example is, you hold them up as meaningful. And you begin to think, how can I act more like them? Or at least you can begin to think that. Now, thinking that and doing it are two very different things. But at the very least, thinking and talking about it keeps the idea and the examples of justice and piety alive in a way that can inspire us, not all the time, but some of the time, to act more justly and piously. So you're in a library, so I won't ask you to chime in there, Katie, but I hope that was helpful. Jason asks or says, I would very much appreciate hearing the notion of love as the inspiration for thinking from another voice. You mean someone else speaking? Eros? I have some ideas from my upbringing, but this seems the crux. Do you want to talk about it, Jason? Is that what you mean? or you want someone else to talk about it?
No, I definitely would like to hear some more interpretation of where Arendt was coming from and going to with that. It seems like it really kind of grounds the notion of thinking, and I really am kind of on the edge of my seat here.
Okay. I mean, obviously, the source for this is Plato's Symposium, and the speech of Diotima in the Symposium, where love is said to be an erotic search, and teaching and love are connected. But let's just take a look at one or two lines at the end of the book on 178 of this chapter on 178 and 79, and let people chime in. She says, what I call the quest for meaning, remember we're in thinking we quest for meaning, not truth, appears in Socrates' language as love. That is, love in its Greek significance of eros, not the Christian agape. Love as eros is primarily a need. It desires what it has not. Men love wisdom and therefore begin to philosophize because they are not wise. And they love beauty and do beauty, as it were, because they are not beautiful. Love is the only matter in which Socrates pretends to be an expert. So just a few comments on that, and I'm happy to have other people chime in. Socrates can be an expert in love because he knows what he needs, and thus what he doesn't have. And he knows that he doesn't have wisdom, and thus that he needs it. He knows that he doesn't have knowledge and seeks it. And so it's this sense of need that drives us. That's the first point that comes to mind. The second is, and this comes back to what I was just saying about examples, we only can be inspired to love things that are good. Beauty, truth, justice, piety. And we are not going to be inspired by evil, by bad, which is why examples of moral actions in the Kantian sense can inspire us to be moral. So by desiring what it has not, love establishes a relationship with what is not present. In order to bring this relationship into the open, make it appear, men want to speak about it, just as the lover wants to speak about the beloved. You want to speak about the beloved, not to know it or capture it, but to speak about it because you're enraptured by it. It's appealing to you. You admire it. Because thought's quest is a kind of desirous love, the objects of thought can only be lovable things, beauty, wisdom, justice, and so on. I'll skip just a couple bits. This is why Socrates believed no one could do evil voluntarily, because of, as we would say, its ontological status. It consists in an absence in something that is not. And Arendt, I don't think, agrees with that. But Jason, you want to say anything about it? Put you on the spot again. Is there any particular part of that you find meaningful?
Yeah, I mean, as you dig into the back end of the concluding paragraph, we have a lot of pinpointing the desire for identifying meaning, and there is a great deal of thought in other traditions that attempts to approach that from the perspective of that there is a fundamental basic goodness in that pervades the human condition, because we procreate and we reproduce, and you could even take this down to a genome question, a biology question. Those things that did not support procreation and reproduction were not successful, and so they were removed. And so justice and beauty and these pieties came forward as the definition of good because they allowed for the human race to persist. And it really gets down to that kind of very basic fundamental concept of what is good, and that becomes a measure on the scales of meaning, that you can then balance the relative world that you're looking at with other people's notion of truth and be able to say, are we meaningful in what we're talking about? But this is me coming to this from two other traditions entirely, and trying to finally come to terms with where Arendt is really trying to take us here with the help, following in the footsteps of Socrates, to actually understand that identity is almost the biggest problem we deal with. And that it is only through almost that, neos, the complete wonder, investment in one's, awareness, critical thinking, overcoming your priors, overcoming identity, that you can actually fully be a realized thinking human being.
Yeah, I mean, you'll see when these are great thoughts. You'll see when you get to the very end of this section on thinking, she's going to end with a claim that you can't judge thinking or judging by success in the postscript. And you've sort of made an interesting claim that meaning, in this quest for meaning, has a certain kind of genetic or evolutionary value, which I think is an interesting question. I wonder if that's true. It may actually be the opposite, which would be my inclination. But let's keep that in mind as we read the next 2 or 3 sections, because I think it'll keep coming up. We're going to get more into this. The next 2 or 3 sections continue with this line of thought. I realize we're running out of time, and there's a bunch more questions. Nancy writes, does Sophocles' Antigone interrogate the idea of obedience to the law? What would... yes. What would Hannah Arendt say about Antigone's defiance of Creon's edict not to bury one of her brothers?
Right. Here. What I really was asking was, would she consider a character like Antigone to be thinking?
I think so. I mean, I don't recall her. I don't remember if she's. I mean, I know she's cited the Antigone. I'm not sure how much she's.
I thought, but I couldn't remember.
I don't remember her holding up Antigone as a model or not. But yes, I think she would consider Antigone. I mean, it's hard to say, because on the one hand, Antigone is clearly disobeying Creon, but she couches her disobedience in a claim of obedience to another law. But yes, I think she's clearly someone who's thinking. At least that's my reading of it. I don't know enough to say about what Arendt thinks about that per se. Robert McDermott writes on page 147, Arendt says Sartre's nausea is by far the most important of his philosophical works. What about the being of nothing? Wouldn't Sartre disagree with her proposition? Maybe. That's what she thinks. I don't even know if she read all of his works. This is the kind of thing Arendt says often as a throwaway. But she clearly thought nausea was a. I think Sam talked about this last week. You've heard me talk about it a lot. I mean, one of the fundamental ideas in Arendt's thought is what she'll call in different ways the break of tradition, the rise of the modern age, the rise of modern loneliness, The problem is that we live the loss of banisters, the thinking without banisters. We live at a time in which, unlike any other time in the history of the world, where we don't all love the world, or we find loving the world very difficult. And in fact, it's much easier to be nauseated by the world. And I think she sees Sartre's nausea as a brilliant illustration of that deep cultural characteristic of our time. Hannah writes, the combination of sortition and citizens' assembly did play a major role in the focus group sort of way of considering the issue, although I'm not sure what issue we're talking about. I'm going to skip that for now because we're out of time. Kim writes, I think that people's need for control is a very much a part of why people follow values that they don't necessarily agree with or benefit from. An example is how and why our recent election went the way it did. Our value system as society has been changing over the last several years, and some of those things have changed within the value system, have changed more faster than many people have been ready for. They don't understand the changes, and they don't like the changes that have been essentially forced upon them. That's all right. The change in values feels like a loss of control for many people, so they grasp for a set of values that simply be a reaction against the changes. I think that's right, too. A reaction that does not involve thought at all is simply a reaction driven by a need for control. I think it's well said, Kim. Thank you. I'm gonna let us end with Kim. That's all well said, and I thank you guys all for the discussion. I thought it was this is where this book pays off, and also in the next 2 or 3 chapters. So we're gonna have a lot of fun. I hope you continue to enjoy reading Arendt, and we'll see you, Sam, in 2 weeks? Next week? I always forget the schedule. I think it's in 2 weeks. Thank you all very much. 2 weeks, yes. Thank you. Enjoy reading Arendt, and we'll see you in 2 weeks. Thanks very much.